I think it's the kind of the consumer that's going to continue to drive the bus here, and that's going to be a function of kind of what happens with tariff-driven inflation. Can consumers hang in, or not? You start to see some compression there. From a freight rate standpoint, I still think there's a case for spot market line haul rates being up, not the 30 to 40% that I was projecting back in January, but certainly I think there's a case for 10 to 15, unless the economy goes into a full-blown recession. If this kind of the fog clears to some degree, businesses can make more kind of long-term decisions as more of these trade agreements get permanent, whatever the hell that means, right? These days, where it's does China stay where it's at really? Is Vietnam staying firm? Where are we with Canada and Mexico? And as that becomes more firm, do you start to see supply chains redeploying capital, and you start to see any version of recalibration taking place, right? So as total landed cost changes, certainly entire supply chains aren't likely relocating back to the U.S. But do you see businesses making different sourcing decisions, where you might take 30% of your imports that made more sense to import from China or Southeast Asia and divert some of that to the U.S. now? Not full on, but do you start to see some of those lanes changing? Do you start to see that creating a bit of an asymmetric tailwind for U.S. manufacturing? Do you start to see network shifting? And you kind of see this during disruption events where a big storm comes in and suddenly contractor lanes go away because lanes networks change. You have a full splash of freight into the spot market. As more of these global supply chains do take some level of recalibration, do you see higher volume predictable contract import lanes suddenly becoming mini bids, as some of that freight gets kind of resourced out in the market as things change. So if you see some of that take place, you could see you get a bit of a asymmetric kind of tailwind relative to the level of consumption that could have a marginal impact on freight market. I'm not basing the forecast on that, right? Because that's kind of a derivative of three chains of what ifs. But then on the supply side, I think there is something to the spot market being arguably unprofitable for the last 6 or 7 quarters. The latest kind of ATRA survey data I think had marginal cost of truckload transportation up 26%, 24 versus 2000, while all-in spot rates were down like 15%. Arguably, certainly a lot happened in those 4 years, but at some point that math just doesn't math. And I think you are seeing just these more anecdotal cases of larger carriers, 100 truck plus fleets that have been on the record saying, look, we haven't made money since 2022. And as we watched the Samantha Jones Meet for Coffee podcast back in January, had high hopes for kind of where the market was headed. But now with this trade war, a lot of that optimism has dimmed, and you'll see, I think, more of those folks, unfortunately, having no choice but either permanently or temporarily idle those fleets. So I think as that comes together, again, I don't think we're seeing rocket ship plus 40% anymore, but I also don't think that there's a case for rates going much lower. So we're either kind of skidding at the bottom here, or there's some case for a slow melt up to say a 10, 12% inflationary scenario.